Pat Berger and Therese Bartholomew, both pioneers in the study of Sino-Tibetan art, whose work has also inspired my own, have given talks to you about similar topics on the dialogue between Tibetan and Chinese artistic traditions. Today I will be looking at this material particularly through the lens of power politics, asking the question, why were the rulers of China interested in Tibetan Buddhism in creating this art? Or put more plainly, what was in it for the courts? This draws on a project I am developing for an exhibition opening at the Rubin Museum next February called Faith and Empire, Art and Politics in Tibetan Buddhism. And I welcome and encourage you all to come and see it. There we go. Tibetan Buddhism's dynamic political role was a major catalyst in moving it beyond Tibet's borders east to its neighbors, the Tongguts, Mongols, Chinese, and Manchus. Tibetan Buddhism was especially attractive to conquest dynasties as it offered both a legitimizing model of universal sacral kingship that transcended ethnic and clan divisions, which could unite disparate people, and also promised esoteric means to physical power, that is, ritual magic, which could be harnessed to expand empires. By the 12th century, Tibetan masters became renowned across northern Asia as bestowers of this anointed rule and occult power. The use of reincarnation in particular as a means of succession was a unique Tibetan form of political legitimacy employed by the courts in Tibet and brought to the empires to their east. Images were one of the primary means of political propagation, integral to magic rites and embodiments of power. While Buddhist involvement in politics might seem an anathema, this stems from Western perceptions of tradition, which are largely romanticized projections born from its colonial encounters. The notion that this is a religion of nonviolence is a popular misconception, resulting from a separation from this history. In politics, this faith was a path to legitimation and a means to power, its ritual a potential weapon of war, and art its conduit. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's message of nonviolence is inspirational around the world, but this has not been historically the emphasis, but rather born out of the 20th century, inspired by Gandhian ideals. To project this back into the past is both ahistorical and misleading, though projecting interests of the present back into the past is as old as history itself. My objective here is to reground Tibetan Buddhism in its art and its art in its historical context and highlight a dynamic aspect of the tradition that may run counter to popular perception, yet is critical to understanding its importance on the world stage. Buddhism has been engaged as a political force from very early on across Asia, and in Tibet, religious and political authority became so intertwined as to be inseparable. War magic, in particular, was an integral part of asserting political authority in Tibet and became of major interest to the courts of Asia. So, anyone surprised yet? Court patronage played a central role in the support and spread of Buddhism throughout Asia. With the spread of Buddhism came the transmission of a complex visual culture that continued to develop as it adjusted to each cultural context. A sustained meeting and coexistence of different traditions often occurred when one group ruled over another, but patronized several Buddhist traditions simultaneously, such as the Mongol and Manchu Empire's rule of China. This provided fertile territory for the emergence of hybrid traditions, as the visual language was shaped by patrons' needs and the combination of imported models and local artists commissioned to make these works, which in turn took on their own political significance. Oops. There we go. It is in the Tang dynasty that the Chinese truly encounter Tibetans in the form of the Tibetan Empire, which became one of the great military powers of Asia, and the Tang's greatest military rival. The Tibetans themselves did not appear as an identifiable people until this period, from the 7th to the 9th century, with the rise of the Tibetan Empire, when disparate people were united, a written language established, and a perception of kinship formed that was not there before. Our story begins in 634, when the first diplomatic mission from the Tibetans arrived at the Tonggut court, and a subsequent request for a Chinese princess for a bride, in other words, a marriage alliance. The Chinese refused this request. However, when the Tibetan forces pushed deep into Chinese territory, the Chinese court suddenly had a change of heart and became willing to enter into negotiations. The Tibetan High Minister Gar, who was sent to negotiate the marriage, was immortalized in this famous painting by Yun Liban, a court painter known for his faithfulness in recording foreigners' visits to the court. From this painting and Chinese accounts, one can glean something of the early Tibetan material culture, including what they wore, and note the Sasanian-style rondels that ornament Minister Gar's robes. The court of the Tibetan Empire was greatly interested in the outside world, with Sasanian silver, such as you see here, Greek-trained doctors from via Persia, Indian scholars, and Chinese-style record-keeping. And so, for instance, the lions that you see here, which are a popular symbol of royalty in Central Asia, became a royal symbol in Tibet. Whoops. In 641, the Chinese princess Wencheng Gongzhu, seen here on the right, departed from the Tang capital Chang'an for Tibet. This marriage between the first Tibetan emperor Songtsen Gampo, here at center, and the Chinese princess Wencheng was the first political union of China and Tibet, and much emphasis is placed on this marriage by the modern Chinese government. One could even call it something of a fetish. Wencheng is described as a civilizing force in Tibet, though she was but 13 or 14 years old at the time, credited with building Ramoche Temple and bringing the most famous sacred image in Tibet, the Jowo Shakyamuni, which now resides in the Jokang, another temple in Lhasa built by Songtsen Gampo's Nepalese wife. So you see, the Chinese princess was but one of several political marriages. And the Jokang is the central chapel of the temple that tragically caught fire over the Lunar New Year this year, and the extent of the damage is still not known. In 676, the Tibetans made their first foray into China proper in Gansu, threatening Tang wealth and world position. At the apex of Tibetan power, when Tibet invaded deep into China proper, climaxing with the Tibetans marching into the Tang capital Chang'an itself in 763, even going so far as to place their own puppet emperor on the Tang throne. And these maps give you a sense of the expansion of the Tibetan Empire north in the Silk Route and east into China from 634 to 763. The earliest surviving Sino-Tibetan artistic exchange also dates to this time. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the Tibetan Empire ruled over large Chinese subject populations in the Heshi area of Gansu, including Dunhuang, which is marked here by the red diamond. An important center of Buddhist activity in the Gobi Desert at the eastern end of the Silk Route, with a long tradition of cave temples stretching back to the 4th century, with 492 caves containing some 45,000 square meters of wall paintings, and this, the Tang period, was considered its artistic golden age. The Tibetans participated in the patronage of local workshops, as well as introducing and incorporating new visual forms in the locally established traditions. At the beginning of Tibetan rule of Dunhuang in 781, Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan art were still early in their formative stages. As the first Tibetan monastery, Samye, was founded only 2 years before in 779, coinciding with the adoption of Buddhism as the Tibetan state religion. Thus, the translation and artistic activity at Dunhuang itself also had a significant impact on what was to become Tibetan Buddhism. During this period, one sees the appearance of Tibetan figures alongside Chinese in paintings found at Dunhuang, such as this illustration from the death of the Buddha in Cave 158, where the Tibetan emperor leads the rulers of the Buddhist world in grieving for the passing of the Buddha. So, here you can see. This painting was vandalized in the 1970s during the Cultural Revolution. But from a photograph taken by French scholar Paul Pelliot in the early 20th century, we see that this figure was labeled Tsenpo, here in this horizontal cartouche, using the Tibetan imperial dynastic title reserved for the emperor. Note, too, that the Tibetan emperor is larger, and only he is given a canopy over his head, marking his special status. In an illustration from a local Chinese family cave dated 839, the political relationship between China and Tibet is laid bare. The Chinese emperor has lost his sword and is down to 3 tassels of rank on his cap, while the Tibetan emperor is raised on a dais and his camp is armed to the teeth. If you can see all the swords they're wearing. This painting dates to shortly after the region, the Heshi corridor, was ceded by the Tang to the Tibetan Empire in 821-822. Thus, this religious painting, commissioned by one of the local leading Chinese families at Dunhuang, makes a clear and dramatic statement about the local political reality on the ground. Tibetan state patronage at Dunhuang has been suggested in Yulin Cave 25, which appears to be closely related to the Treaty Edict Temple described in 9th century Tibetan documents found at Dunhuang. Dedicated by the local Tibetan military government on the occasion of the signing of the same Sino-Tibetan peace treaty of 821-822. While the style of the paintings are a combination of Chinese and this new aesthetic introduced under Tibetan rule, and here you see a classic Chinese Jingbian of Maitreya's descent, there is a clear unifying theme, that of the Chakravartin ruler. The Chakravartin, or universal wheel-turning king, was a concept of sacral rule in India that was imported to Central and East Asia with Buddhism, whereby conquest by a devout king was seen to spread Buddhism and thus give the divine sanction to expand his empire. This theme of sacrosanct rulership is actually stated in the Treaty Temple's dedication, which is equated with building a divine palace, where the merit generated is dedicated to the Tibetan emperor, and I quote, so that he can become a Chakravartin ruler, extending his authority over the 4 continents and other kingdoms as well. In the wall paintings of Maitreya's descent, a theme well intertwined with the figure of the Chakravartin ruler, a royal Tibetan groom and Chinese bride, in a detail depicting scenes from life under the universal ruler, makes a clear assertion about social harmony under Tibetan rule. Vairochana and the 8 great bodhisattvas, painted on the western wall of Yulin Cave 25, is based on distinct iconic models, which begin to appear during the Tibetan rule. Vairochana became the center of a new Tibetan state cult, where the Tibetan Empire was equated with Vairochana, the cosmic ruler. Within Buddhist cosmology, Vairochana was viewed as the cosmic ruler of the universe and was often adopted in Buddhist cultures across Asia by royal courts and used as a symbol of their imperial rule, a kind of ritual mastery of the universe. It is likely, based on the description in the treaty document, that against the west wall of Cave 25 was a sculptural mandala of Vairochana and the 8 great bodhisattvas. It has been suggested that through this adaptation of Vairochana imagery in Tibet, the empire was viewed as an extended Vairochana mandala, and that such sites as Yulin Cave 25 were intended to ritually mark the inclusion of the Heshi area into the mandala of the Tibetan Empire. And this form of Vairochana in particular was intended to represent the presence of the Tibetan emperor. And here we see an image of the Tibetan emperor on the left, and an image of Vairochana in his royal robes and boots on the right, complete with Sasanian rondels, conflating the identity of ruler and deity. There are also examples of paintings done in a mixture of styles, such as the scroll painting dated by Tibetan and Chinese inscription to 836, which states that it was painted by the monk with the Tibetan name Pelyang. Therefore, not only were paintings at Dunhuang simply continuations of the same Chinese workshops from the High Tang, and Tibetan interests began to assert themselves, and new visual modes appear alongside or even mixed in with Chinese ones. These new forms are of Indic inspiration and can be recognized by the figures with broad shoulders, narrow waists, framed by elliptical pastel-colored halos, and adorned with spired jewelry. Whoops. So here you can see the broad shoulders, the narrow waists, the elliptical halos, and I don't know if you can see the painting's rather damaged, but there are little spires coming off of the crown and all of the jewelry. Even after the collapse of the Tibetan Empire in 842, Tibetan rule of Dunhuang continued for 6 more years, and Tibetan continued to be used locally as the language of trade and diplomacy into the 10th century, even after the fall of the Tang dynasty. Such was the impact of Tibetan rule on the area. Subsequent kingdoms in this region of the Silk Route inherited aspects of this Sino-Tibetan cultural legacy. After the collapse of the Tibetan Empire, its former territories to the east of Lake Kokonor, that is the Qinghai-Gansu area, were united by the Tibetan Tsongkha kingdom during a fragmented period of warfare between vying states. Whoops. Sorry, I've yet to master this remote. But here, we're talking about here. Here's Kokonor, right? Qinghai-hu. Positioning themselves as the inheritors of the Tibetan Empire's political legacy in the east. The Tsongkha kingdom was established by a minister monk who brought an infant prince of the Tibetan imperial family from central Tibet to the area and had him declared emperor in 1008, using the old Tibetan imperial dynastic title, Tsempo. The kingdom of Tsongkha served as an important buffer state between the Song dynasty and its rapidly expanding neighbors, the Tangut Empire of Xisha to the west. And here you can see in the figures the continuation of this same Tibetan aesthetic into the 10th century. Tibetan Tsongkha was also the Song dynasty's gateway to the west, providing the Chinese with much-needed horses, the medieval world's most valuable military asset. Despite the fact that the Tsongkha kingdom served as an effective ally of the Song against the Tanguts, the Chinese attacked Tsongkha in 1104, presumably as part of their attempt to assert control over the western regions, but were too weak to hold on to it, and the area was eventually absorbed by the Song's rivals, the Tanguts. And this horse here, in Li Gonglin's famous 5 tribute horses, is actually offered by the Tsongkha ruler. The Tangut kingdom of Xisha, a small but powerful multi-ethnic kingdom along the Silk Route, first established many of the imperial practices of Tibetan Buddhism, art, and court, later emulated by larger regimes, especially the Mongol Empire. Tibetan and Chinese religious and artistic traditions were integrated through Tangut patronage, creating a new visual model of sacral rule. These included both political and artistic forms that later became characteristic of an imperial engagement with Tibetan Buddhism until the 20th century. The Tangut Empire of Xisha was an expansionist multi-ethnic state, directly on the Silk Route between Tibet and China, and included large Tibetan and Chinese subject populations. So here you can see on this map, the Tanguts are at the multiple cultural crossroads, right? You have the Mongols above, the Tibetans to the southwest, and the Chinese to the southeast. The Tanguts drew heavily on Chinese models in establishing their own imperial culture, including governmental administration and their own script. However, with the fall of Northern Song in 1127, coupled with a dynamic revival of Buddhist activity in Tibet in the 11th, 12th centuries, the Tanguts turned increasingly west to Tibet and for the Tibetan realm for guidance. Shortly after the incorporation of Tsongkha territories into Xisha, the custom of a Tibetan Buddhist monk serving as imperial preceptor at the Tangut court was established. Buddhism served the state in legitimation and engendered lavish patronage at court, the Tanguts presenting themselves as sacral Chakravartin rulers. Among the northern nomads, the Tangut emperors were known as the Buddha Khan. The Tanguts employed a self-conscious multicultural strategy, editing texts in 3 languages at once, Tangut, Chinese, and Tibetan. In their art, one also sees a mixing of both the Chinese and Tibetan iconographic as well as stylistic traditions to meet the Tangut patron's particular needs. This can be seen from objects excavated from the Tangut sites such as Karakoto, as well as caves dating to their rule of Dunhuang, which they absorbed in 1036. For instance, in this painting excavated at the Tangut site of Karakoto, this combination is quite striking, for while the central triad of Amitabha and the 2 bodhisattvas, as well as the Pure Land scenes below, are drawn from iconographic and stylistic modes of the Chinese Southern Song, here, the 8 healing Buddhas above, left and right, are Tibetan depictions, here, clearly mixing Chinese and Tibetan genres. One hallmark of the Tangut court was the lavish silk images, such as embroidered cut silk, or kese, a complex luxury silk medium developed by the Chinese and adopted by the Tangut court. for the making of Tibetan Buddhist icons. The Tongguts were the source of many such imperial court practices, integrating Tibetan Buddhist imagery with Chinese artistic techniques that would be emulated for centuries to come. And here's a little detail showing the seed pearls, stitched directly into the fabric. And here's just a detail to show you the lovely quality. Indeed, the continued debate in distinguishing Tangut Xisha and Mongol Yuan objects, especially silks, speaks to the close relationship between these two court traditions and the continuity of this visual production from the 12th into the 13th and 14th centuries. For instance, an image in a beautiful Kese Tanka of Achala was published as from the Tangut Xisha in the groundbreaking exhibition When Silk Was Gold in 1997, while just a year later, the major Guggenheim exhibition, China 5,000 Years, redates the same work as a Yuan 13th to 14th century object. We all have our opinions. The printed icon of a wrathful deity, excavated from the Tangut site of Harakoto, bears invocations which make its political role clear. At the top, Om fierce great Lord, please protect. At right, long life to the emperor. And at left, peace to the people, grandeur to the state. The wrathful deity Mahakala, in particular, became a special focus of Tangut imperial Buddhism. Mahakala is a powerful Buddhist protector deity, a manifestation of divine wrath used in removing obstacles, and historically considered especially effective in military applications. For instance, one Tibetan Buddhist cleric who is tied to the Tangut imperial line, Tamilotawa, is linked to at least 16 texts on this wrathful deity, Mahakala, including one called The Instructions of Sri Mahakala, The Usurpation of Government, a short how-to work on overthrowing a state and taking power, right? So not so subtle, even in the title. Indeed, Mongol interests in Tibetan Buddhism can be traced to their potent encounter with this wrathful deity, Mahakala, through their military campaign against the Tangut Empire of Xisha early in the 1200s. By the time of the Mongol invasion, Tibetan clerics served as imperial preceptors at the Xisha court, where Mahakala was a focus of the Tangut Buddhism. When Chinggis Khan first laid siege to the Tangut capital in 1207, the Tongut's Tibetan court chaplain summoned Mahakala to the battlefield, at which point the dams the Mongols were using to flood the city burst, drowning Mongol troops and forcing Chinggis to withdraw. This account of the unusual military setback through effective religious ritual no doubt caught Mongol attention. Later, both the Buddhist model of Chakravartin's sacral rule and the cult of Mahakala in particular, both ministered by Tibetan clerics, were adopted by the Mongolian state. And this is actually the form of Mahakala that was summoned to swat away the Mongol troops. The Mongols established the largest contiguous empire in world history, from the Korean peninsula to the gates of Vienna. And this map shows the Mongol Empire in around 1260 when Kublai Khan came to power. The Mongols conquered most of Asia in the 13th century, thereby bringing Tibetan visual culture to the Chinese heartland. While Kublai established a government on a Chinese system, rather than depending on the Chinese literati, they relied heavily on peoples from other areas of his empire, such as the Uyghurs, Tongguts, and Tibetans. While the Mongol Empire was known for a policy of religious tolerance among the peoples they conquered, and for generous patronage across a broad spectrum of religions, Kublai Khan singled out Tibetan Buddhism among the faiths competing for court attention. The wrathful figure of Mahakala in particular became state protector and focus of the imperial cult, and a sculpture of this deity made for Kublai Khan's final assault on the remains of the Chinese Empire, the Southern Song, became a potent symbol of both Kublai's rule and the Yuan imperial lineage. This association was so strong that even 4 centuries later, when the Manchus, lacking the proper bloodlines, traced their own spiritual ancestry to Kublai Khan, as the rightful inheritors of his Yuan legacy, installed Kublai Khan's statue of Mahakala in their own imperial shrine in 1635. Why the Mongols embraced Tibetan Buddhism has tended to be addressed in a cursory and often somewhat derogatory manner, adopting the distaste for both the Mongols and Tibetans reflected in Chinese literati sources. observing that Tibetans were likely chosen as the imperial preceptors because they specialized in magic rituals which appealed to the unsophisticated Mongols. Evidence suggests that Mongol interest in Tibetan Buddhism actually lay in both a model of sacrosanct rulership that allowed them to unite an empire across ethnic and clan divides, as well as corresponding esoteric means to real physical power that could be harnessed to serve the Mongol Imperium. In other words, their interest in Tibetan Buddhism was actually quite practical. One could even say utilitarian. More concrete evidence of this source of Mongol interest in Tibetan Buddhism can be found in the direction and character the ensuing Mongol expedition into Tibetan territory took, launched from the former Tangut capital. 1 year after Chinggis's grandson, Khotan Khan, set up his camp in Tangut lands, he sent an expeditionary force led by a surrendered Tangut into Tibetan territory, specifically to monasteries active in the former Tangut court. While the Mongols did sack a number of Tibetan monasteries, they spared the main source of preceptors to the Tangut court, which were among the wealthiest in their path, suggesting that the Mongols were eager to take over this relationship with their former court chaplains. During their initial expeditions into Tibetan territory, the Mongols learned of one of the great Tibetan scholars of the time, Sakya Pandita, and escorted him back to the Mongol court as a representative of Tibetan interests. 2 years later, when the former Tangut territory was given to Kublai Khan, Kublai also took possession of Sakya Pandita's nephew, including the Tibetan cleric Pagpa. So here we have Kublai Khan in his distinctive hat and Chögyal Pagpa. In 1260, Kublai declared himself the Great Khan, leading the civil war and fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, Kublai maintaining control of Asia. Pagpa initiated Kublai into Tibetan Buddhist rites, and in turn, Kublai, as part of his offerings, granted Pagpa suzerainty of Tibet, in the name of the Mongol Empire, of course. Later, when Kublai Khan declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty, he made Pagpa imperial preceptor, the highest religious authority in the land. As part of his investiture, he had the crystal seal of the Tangut emperor recreated for Pagpa, likely in emulation of Tangut court ritual. This gave symbolic weight to the Mongols as conscious inheritors of the Tanguts in a priest-patron relationship with the Tibetans. Pagpa also developed a new script based on Tibetan, called Pagpa script, to phonetically render all of the disparate language of Kublai's empire, which was employed on official documents and insignia such as seals and passports, such as the passport you see here. Significantly, Kublai also had Pagpa tutor his heir apparent, Jingam. It has recently been suggested that some of these key political moments were depicted in 2 portraits of Pagpa: the initiation of Kublai Khan and his offering of Tibet to Pagpa as part of initiations in 1264, which you see here, and this is a later copy, but here you can see Kublai. And Pagpa being appointed imperial preceptor by Kublai Khan in 1270. And note Kublai Khan and his wife Chabi, herself known for her devotion to Tibetan Buddhism, and Pagpa in particular, depicted smaller to Pagpa's left, hands clasped in reverence. Right. Actually quite a nice portrait. Later, memorial halls for Pagpa were sponsored by the court throughout the empire, which would have included his image. Until the fall of the dynasty, it became Yuan practice to appoint Tibetans imperial preceptors. This relationship between the Mongol Emperor Kublai and his Tibetan chaplain Pagpa, often characterized as a priest-patron relationship, became a model that would be invoked by subsequent imperial courts and their Tibetan preceptors for centuries to come. And here we have the third Karmapa's face appearing in the moon to the last Yuan emperor, Togan Temur, which became a famous Yuan court painting and model for later Chinese Tibetan painting as well. A special appreciation and dispensation for craftsmen under Mongol rule, first established by Chinggis Khan, continued under Kublai, and the arts flourished under Mongolian patronage. Pagpa recommended a young Nepalese artist named Aniga for service at the Mongol court, and so impressed Kublai Khan that he quickly rose to supervisor-in-chief of all artisans at court. Aniga was commissioned to produce a variety of Buddhas and stupas in the imperial capital, Shangdu and Dadu, that is modern Beijing, including steel dharma wheels, right, which is the symbol of the Chakravartin ruler, which were used as imperial standards. and portraits in silk of Kublai and Chabi for the imperial temple. Aniga's most visible imprints remaining on the Chinese landscape are two majestic white stupas, one in the imperial capital in Beijing, built in 1279, which is the one you see here, and the other on Manjushi's sacred mountain Wutaishan, built in 1301. While much of these Yuan materials have been lost, other surviving objects which bear a distinct Nepalese aesthetic, but made in Chinese luxury mediums newly employed for the creation of Tibetan Buddhist images during the Yuan, included dry lacquer sculpture. I wish this piece could leave the freer so we could borrow it. No dice. Still, the influence of Nepalese art on the Yuan has yet to be fully understood. While Aniga and his son were appointed head of the imperial workshops and trained Chinese artists at court, little of their production seems to have survived, or at least been identified, and no work has yet been reliably attributed to Aniga himself. For instance, this painting of Tara in the Cleveland Museum has been attributed to Aniga, but without much evidence at all, or any really. And some Nepalese experts feel that this is actually a 14th century painting, so probably wishful thinking, right? Famous painting, famous artists. There's this tendency to want to put them together. I'm going to feel a little blowback for that, I'm sure. Anyway, many questions remain, such as, if Aniga was so important, why is he not mentioned once in any of Imperial Preceptor Pagpa's biographies? Still, after some 50 years of Mongol-backed Sakya rule in Tibet, the Nepalese idiom dominated in Tibet for some 200 years, so its importance should not be treated lightly. Hopefully, with the eventual opening of important repositories like Sakya Monastery and its famous library, more about Aniga and the Nepalese role in the Yuan will be better understood. Lushly produced Tibetan Buddhist icons in the very same silk technique popular in the Tangut court became a signature of Mongol imperial court production, such as this monumental kese in the Metropolitan Museum. Its large scale is consistent with records of UN imperial commissions, which are always 9.5 by 8 feet. And while this is the only surviving complete example, this particular commission is not recorded. But then again, neither is the famous portrait of Kublai Khan, so I didn't worry about it too much. Two Mongolian Khans at the lower left and their spouses at lower right are named by Tibetan cartouches and given titles. King Tuk Timur and his older brother, here named Prince Koshila, with their respective spouses. The political intrigues around these four imperial figures is fascinating and helps us contextualize this object, as Tuk Timur, the son of a Tangut empress, or consort, came to power as the result of a coup d'etat in 1328. His older brother, Koshila, only reigned briefly from February 27th to August 30th, 1329, when he was then assassinated by Tuk Timur's entourage out of fear of his military strength and a resulting Chagatai Khanate influence on the Yuan dynasty. Tuk Timur was then re-enthroned but died of disease 3 years later. The titles differentiated in the Tibetan cartouches in the Met silk would suggest that King Tuk Timur was already named Khan in September 1328, but Prince Koshila was not yet enthroned in February 1329, placing the design, if not creation, in late 1328 or early 1329. After the Mongols conquered the Tanguts and absorbed them in 1227, members of the Tang clergy continued to be employed under the Mongols. The Tanguts' versatility, being adept at Tibetan and Chinese linguistic, doctrinal, as well as artistic traditions, was no doubt valued by the Mongols in both forging and implementing the political and doctrinal policies of their own empire, which followed numerous Tangut precedents. The most prominent example is in the notorious minister Yang, in Tibetan Rinchen Gyap, who was made head of the Bureau of Religious Affairs of Southeast China in 1277. And here we're moving to Hangzhou on the east coast of China, marked by this red star. In his sponsorship, one sees a focus on subduing the land of the newly conquered territories of South China. by building stupas and re-establishing former Buddhist monuments, including those on the sites of Taoist temples, former Sung palaces, and even Sung tombs. He got a very bad name for himself there. His activities in the Hangzhou area, including commissioning numerous stone sculptures, niches, carved directly into the local landscape at Feilaifang, date to between 1282 and 1292. The statues vary from completely Chinese appearance, such as this famous reclining Buddha Maitreya, to deities clearly based on Tibetan artistic models, which were dominant in both the Tangut and Mongol courts, such as this majestic Ushnitsa Vijaya. Many of these 13th century images are a fusion of these two traditions, Tibetan in iconography with five-leaf crowns, sitting above rounded Chinese faces. Other evidence of Mongol court adaptation and continuation of Tangut practice was the enormous undertaking of the printing of the Tangut edition of the Buddhist canon in 1301 to 1302 in Hangzhou, one of China's largest and most important printing centers. These frontispieces were also repurposed for other printing projects, such as the massive Qisha canon in about 1302, also overseen by a Tangut. These incorporated numerous translations of Tibetan texts, such as Pakpa's advice to Kublai's son, the crown prince. However, many of the Tibetan texts added into the Chinese Buddhist canon during the Yuan were actually translated under the Tanguts. 9 of the 10 known frontispieces made for the Qisha canon show a distinct mixing of Tibetan and Chinese imagery and are quite similar to both the 1302 Tangut canon and extant Tangut xylographs. These frontispieces could be printed with any number of texts, thus the woodblocks would have been worn out quite quickly and required to be recarved many times. So it's difficult to say which printings are original and when they might date to. Nonetheless, they appear to be faithful representatives of the early 14th century images, some of them even preserving the names of the original Chinese illustrator, Chen Sheng, here on the left. There's a little detail. And Chen Ning, here on the right. So here, for instance, you can see, right, you have a Tibetan form with this very Indic Nepalese throne back with the makuras and the Garuda, and then you have a Chinese royal figure here paying homage in front. Tangut inscriptions also found on politically significant geo-religious monuments, such as Juyongguan Stupa Gate to the north of Beijing, even as late as 1345, over a century after the fall of Xixia. Gates such as these were used to mark the cardinal directions in delineating the sacred space of a city, like those gates found in the depiction of a divine realm of a deity's palace, or mandala. A number of the various inscriptions in Tibetan, Pakpa script, Chinese, Tangut, and Uyghur lining the walls of the gates declare Kublai Khan as an emanation of the Bodhisattva of wisdom Manjushri, clearly establishing the sacral nature of his rulership and his empire. This point will become especially significant when the Manchus conquer China and declare themselves Kublai Khan's spiritual and political inheritors, as emanations of the same deity. While there has been some debate about whether or not Kublai Khan was really considered Manjushri in his own lifetime, evidence of contemporary Tibetans questioning this validity of its assertion suggests it was, right? So in Tibetan primary sources we say, right, if this guy was really a bodhisattva, why does he need to use intimidation and violence? So, not universally accepted at the time. As previously mentioned, the wrathful deity Mahakala was made protector of the Mongol Empire and became a focus of the Mongol state. The Tibetan monk Dampa, who you see here, was the primary Mahakala ritual specialist at Kublai Khan's court and was even recognized as an emanation of Mahakala walking on earth. The Persian historiographer Rashid al-Din, in his famous history, which was written in 1300, right, that is within Dampa's lifetime, specifically mentions Dampa as someone whose word carried great weight at the Yuan court and in the Khagan's eyes. Dampa's epitaph stele, erected in 1316, was written by the most famous Chinese calligrapher of his time and scion of the defunct royal Song house, Zhao Mengfu, highlights Dampa's importance at the Mongol court. It has even been suggested that Zhao Mengfu's famous painting, Monk in a Red Robe, which dates to within a year of Dampa's death, commemorates him. Dampa was credited with intervening in several key battles and Temples dedicated to Mahakala were built throughout the empire. In the most famous example, in 1275, Kublai asked Dampa for the protector deity Mahakala to intervene against the southern Song, which his greatest general could not conquer. Dampa consecrated the image of Mahakala made by the Nepalese artist Aniga and performed the rites. Mahakala was seen going house to house on the battlefield, sending Chinese troops fleeing. When the Chinese petitioned their god of war, Junwu, to deliver them from the Mongol onslaught, he left a note on his altar saying that he had to yield to the black god leading the Mongol army. And within a short time, the Chinese surrendered. I can sort of imagine, the old Looney Tunes. Yeah. Interestingly, this account of the fall of southern Song through the intervention of Mahakala is recorded in Chinese sources. Such stories are also corroborated in Tibetan sources, which records that when the captured former Song emperor and his courtiers were brought north and shown the temple, they were astonished to see the image of Mahakala as they had seen him among the Mongol troops. This Tibetan Buddhist sculpture, used in the founding of the Yuan, became one of the three objects emblematic of Mongol kingship: Chinggis Khan's spirit banner, the imperial seal, and Kublai Khan's image of Mahakala. While this famous golden statue of Mahakala disappeared with the fall of the Qing dynasty, whereabouts currently unknown, stay tuned, a very Indic-appearing stone sculpture, which you see here, is dated to the same period, 1292, and is preserved in the Musée Guimet in Paris. Its inscription records that the donor was the learned master or magician, Acharya Pakshi, a close disciple of the imperial preceptor Pagpa, who enjoyed the protection of Kublai Khan. That is, Dampa himself. That's my opinion. This is the Mahakala sculpture. This Mahakala sculpture embodies the religious-political relationship at the heart of Tibetan Buddhist involvement at the Mongol court. In the same year as that great victory in 1275, Dampa petitioned the throne to build a temple to Mahakala in recognition of these services, and a beautiful temple with an imposing statue was built just south of Beijing. Inside the temple was a large statue of Mahakala and smaller statues of his retinue, all made by Dampa himself. The dedicatory inscription of Protection of the Nation Temple records that the Mongol Khans, and I quote, took greatest success due to the blessings of Mahakala. Thus he was admired as the greatest and most powerful protector and was worshipped by the masses in the Great Hall. This stele suggests that Mahakala was the central image at the Protection of the Nation temples during the Yuan, and Mahakala veneration was one of the primary focuses of worship there. The Imperial Patron was the Grand Princess Senge Raki, a famous collector of Chinese art, often touted in Chinese art historical discourse as a heavily Sinified Mongol who had taken on the identity of Chinese literati. And I'm not positive this is of her. There are a number of portraits of consorts and empresses, but the labels fell off in the National Palace Museum in Beijing. But they actually did a whole exhibition on Senge Raki at the National Palace Museum, and this is the kind of the poster child they used, so I'm following in their wake, if you will. Princess Senge was also an avid patron of Tibetan Buddhism, the state cult of Mahakala, and Dampa in particular, revealing that she had not given up her Mongolian identity, but rather suggests the existence of a Mongolian elite that could move skillfully in different cultural circles that compose their multi-ethnic empire which they ruled. While none of the Mahakala temples that Dampa is recorded to have built in China proper survive, an extant metropolitan Yuan dynasty site in the cultural heartland of China, related to the state cult of Mahakala, is a sculptural niche in Hangzhou. This small site, dated by dedicatory inscription 1322, names the donor as a highly placed Yuan military official from the capital. That the patron of this image was a Mongol general is fitting, as Mahakala was seen as the Mongol state protector and god of war. It has even been suggested that the now decapitated sculpture of a monk in a side niche once depicted none other than Dampa himself, and I think there's some local poetry that makes a reference to that. This sculpture must really have been made by a Chinese artist, because the deity really appears like a bearded Chinese general than the Himalayan deity. Even after the collapse of the Mongol Yuan and the Chinese reclaimed their land, establishing the native Ming dynasty, The Chinese court continued to follow Mongol precedents for an imperial Buddhist vocabulary symbolic of divine rule. By this time, Kublai Khan's model of rulership was recognized across Asia, and thus the early Ming rulers were speaking in the accepted language of power and declaring their authority. And here you can see in this map, for instance, that the Mongols are still a major presence, right? They don't just kind of evaporate. This has not been the traditional understanding of the Ming, which is said to have expended a great deal of energy in reasserting an ethnic Chinese identity in the wake of Mongol rule. Tibetan Buddhism continued as a faith of the powerful within the inner court. Thus, a great deal of Tibetan Buddhist art was created in the Ming imperial workshops, both for internal court use and as diplomatic gifts, a projection of what we might call today soft power. A continuation of this Tibetanized visual language of sacral rule can be found in this object found among the gold work excavated from the Prince of Liang's tomb. As we just observed, this form of Mahakala was a centerpiece of Mongol imperial Buddhism and the most potent symbol of Tibetan esoteric power in the Yuan pantheon. While the goldsmith did not understand the form perfectly, he can be recognized by the stick, or gandhi, here, balanced across his arms. If this is indeed a hat ornament, as identified in the excavation report, it's a remarkable political statement that a Ming imperial prince would prominently display an image of the most powerful potent symbol of Yuan power and sacral authority upon his head. The first official expression of Ming interest in Tibetan Buddhism came only a few years after the Ming dynasty was founded, when in 1375, the first Ming emperor, Taizu, of the Hongwu area, sent a letter of praise to the fourth Karmapa Rilpe Dorje, who had held one of the highest positions in the former Yuan court. As previously mentioned, Tibetans provided a model of sacrosanct rulership and esoteric means to power for the Mongol Empire, and the Yuan imperial preceptor, the highest religious authority in the land, was always a Tibetan. Hongwu, formerly a monk under the previous Yuan system, would have been familiar with their role. Indeed, continuity can be traced in Tibetan patriarchs who served both the late Yuan and early Ming courts. But it was Hongwu's son, Ming Chengzu, commonly known by his reign title, Yongle, who was the first Ming emperor to establish significant ties with Tibetan patriarchs. And recently, there has been some acceptance that he was probably a believer in Tibetan Buddhism. As an imperial prince, he was granted the former Mongol capital in Beijing. He took up residence in the former Mongol palace, opened the former imperial libraries and treasuries, which had been preserved and sealed, and retained some of the Yuan palace eunuchs who were left there. This was likely one of the direct conduits of Mongol imperial culture, which would have included Tibetan Buddhist practices into the future Yongle courts. The Yongle emperor is known in Tibetan sources, such as the Blue Annals, as Ye Wang, or the Prince of Yen, right? Yen Jingbir, it's the same Yen. His previous title as the Prince of the Beijing area, suggesting that the Yongle emperor, who was not the crown prince, was well acquainted with Tibetans, and they with him, during his early career in Beijing during the Hongwu era. The most significant event in Sino-Tibetan relations during the early Ming was the visit of the fifth Karmapa, Deshin Shekpa, to the early Ming capital of Nanjing in 1407. In dealing with the Karmapa, Yongle consciously drew on parallels in his own actions to Kublai Khan's relationship with his Tibetan imperial preceptor, Pagpa, during the founding of the previous Yuan dynasty. According to Tibetan sources, Yongle expressed an interest in recreating their priest-patron relationship. Yongle also made a similar offer to send troops into Tibet in order to install him as temporal ruler and forcibly convert all monasteries to his order, an offer which the Karmapa similarly declined. This offer can be seen as something of a trope, as it parallels Kublai's offer to Pagpa, as was Pagpa's declining in favor of religious plurality. Of course, no mention of this is made in Chinese sources, as the Karmapa turning down the emperor's wish to project Ming power into Tibet was not the kind of thing to be recorded in official dynastic histories. Yongle also bestowed on the Karmapa the title Dabao Fawang, or Great Precious King of the Dharma, the same title Kublai bestowed upon Pagpa when the former declared himself Great Khan. And this is actually in the encampment tradition, right, the Karma Gadri, which I studied, which was kindly mentioned in my profuse biography. The Karmapas were of particular interest to Yongle as they were the last preceptors of the Yuan and were reviewed as anointers of sacral rule par excellence. Indeed, after the Karmapa's visit, Yongle styled himself a Chakravartin ruler. And here we see this relation codified where the Yongle is receiving consecration as a sacral ruler. And note the Yongle's face is reflected in the mirror during the ablutions, right? And this looks almost exactly like his official portrait. It's just flipped. Visual evidence for continuity from the Mongol Yuan is the artistic production of the Ming atelier, is the presence of an already fully mature Sino-Tibetan artistic synthesis in the early years of the 15th century. The most famous examples being the bronzes of the Yongle period. Here we see a fusion of Nepalese sensuousness of form with a Chinese aesthetic and a jeweler's-like precision in their ornamentation. The sweep of this figure is quite lovely. It's in Lhasa, so we can't borrow it, but c'est la vie. There's always the catalog. Yuan court prototypes for these Yongle Buddhist images can be found in Yuan woodblock prints and locally in surviving stone-carved images on the Juyongguan Gate, which date to the final years of the Mongol Empire in China. Beyond such well-publicized objects as the Yongle hand scroll, which you see here, which had a clear political agenda in confirming legitimacy on Chengzu's reign, as there was a cloud on how he came to power. Needless to say, violence was involved, which has been well discussed by Pat Berger. By contrast, is the 1413 missive scroll, where the Yongle emperor sent to the fifth Karmapa describing his famous eunuch admiral Zhenghe's voyage to Sri Lanka and capturing the Buddha's tooth relic. In it, the emperor describes his own religious visions, which clearly went well beyond the bounds of what would be required for diplomacy. While discussions of Ming court interest in Tibetan Buddhism tends to be limited to the Yongle emperor, he was by no means the most extreme in Ming rulers in his adoration of Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan art continued to receive significant court patronage, especially under Emperor Xuande Chenghua, but Emperor Wuzong of the Zhengde period was an enthusiastic patron of Tibetan Buddhism who took his zeal to a level few had dared. According to the Wuzong Waiji, and here I have the quote, the emperor studied Tibetan scripture, converted to this religion, dressed in Tibetan monk's robes, and practiced Dharma at court. According to Tibetan sources, Wuzong adopted the Tibetan name Rinchen Palden and even went so far as to style himself an emanation of the seventh Karmapa. Right, so he's saying he's one of the great lamas of the day. Far from wishful thinking on the part of Tibetans, this assertion and the mission of the eunuch envoy who carried the tidings was not received well. Right, I think they thought him he's kind of a nutter. Richardson thus identifies the Tibetan name Rinchen Palden on such tanka as this as none other than the emperor himself. And Marsha Haufler has further contextualized this painting by identifying the occasion of its commission as the emperor's birthday. As we can see, demand for Tibetan objects within the Ming court was strong, and the cause of their creation multivariate. And this is actually in the Berkeley Art Museum, not far from here. Fascinating piece. One wonders about its quality. Interest in Tibetan Buddhism also extends beyond the court. As Marsha Haufler has also observed, not only are Tibetan images representative of a system of belief embraced by Ming rulers, they also represent a category of Ming culture, and I quote, fashionable among the upper-class devotees of Buddhism throughout the Ming period. A compelling example of private Chinese patronage of Tibetan Buddhist images in the Ming is the commissioning of the marvelous images, names, sutra, and dharani of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, which you see here, printed in 1431 in Beijing. This is a woodblock collection of popular texts and illustrations as conveyed by the fifth Karmapa, who's depicted in this image. Although there are colophons in Chinese, Lansa, Tibetan, and Mongol, the primary language of the text is Chinese, suggesting that the patron was also Chinese. It is interesting to note, regarding the Chinese interest in Tibetan images, that in the colophon, the patron specifically expresses his desire that the illustrations be in Tibetan style. Moving beyond the emperor at court, eunuchs were also important conduits between the creation of art at court and its support of Tibetan Buddhism. This was due to their intersecting layers of the eunuch bureaucracy at the Ming court, both in their roles as the controllers of the imperial construction apparatus, the Ministry of Works, and as the official imperial envoys to the Tibetan patriarchs. Thus, the eunuchs were in a close contact with the Tibetan clerics at court and often became their personal patrons. And they also used their positions in overseeing court artists to create Tibetan Buddhist images. And this sculpture here in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco bears an inscription saying that it was commissioned by a eunuch. I think this is also the same as the curious reign as the curious emperor we just talked about. The principal patron of a small private temple on the outskirts of Beijing, founded in 1443, Fa Hai Si, anyone goes to Beijing and you haven't, you should really visit, was a eunuch of the inner court who served as a director of all imperial artists, the director of imperial accoutrements, or the Yu Yongjian. While the basic architectural and painting programs of Fa Hai Si are clearly Chinese, a subtle Tibetan presence is observable in various Tibetan forms that appear throughout the temple. For example, on the ceiling in each of the 3 coffered bays over the central altar are 3 large mandala, which are linked to Tibetan mortuary liturgy, such as the central Vairochana, which you see here, which is specifically related to the purification of all rebirths tantra. In this way, the Tibetan mandala on the ceiling are linked functionally to the wall paintings of the Chinese water land, or Shui Lu Jai, ritual paintings on the walls in their role for the salvation of the dead. And here's a detail of Marichi from that same wall painting wearing a 5-leaf Tibetan crown. And the squatting form of our old friend Mahakala, here on the right, was once found among the statuary, but sadly destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. Direct evidence of a significant Tibetan presence at Fa Hai Si is found in the 10 Tibetan names on the back of the record of Fa Hai Si stele. The first and most famous of the list, depicted in this Xuande period woven silk tanka, the Dazi Fa Wang, or Great Compassionate King of the Dharma, Shakya Yeshe. Shakya Yeshe was a personal attendant to Tsongkhapa, the founder of Sera Monastery, and the third of the 3 main Tibetan patriarchs received in the by the Yongle Emperor. Originally, it was Tsongkhapa, founder of the Giluk order, who was invited by the Yongle Emperor, not mentioned in Chinese sources again. But finally, after repeated requests, Tsongkhapa sent his disciple Shakya Yeshe to the Ming court in his stead. This remarkably intricate silk embroidery was given to Shakya Yeshe in about 1419, and he's actually depicted on the top right. Sorry, I tried to get a detail for you, but it didn't come in time. This will be in the exhibition. It's never been shown before. Very exciting. However, there is one problem with the presence of Shakya Yeshe's name on Fa Hai Si's donor stele. Shakya Yeshe died in 1435 en route to Tibet, while construction of Fa Hai Si did not begin until 4 years later in 1439. The third name on the stele, Palden, is the most interesting in the context of this discussion, for he not only appears to have played a role in the founding of Fa Hai Si, but also was abbot of Chutansi in Qinghai, far away on the Sino-Tibetan border, a provincially located temple built with imperial sponsorship. Palden was directly involved with the Buddhist practice in Beijing. He wielded significant influence within the National Buddhist Registry, the Sanglu Si. He served as the 5th Karmapa's translator at court in Nanjing in 1406, translated numerous Tibetan texts into Chinese, and ordained several Ming officials, including some of those sent to expand Chutansi. Chutansi, in Tibetan Drotang Dorjechang, was founded in 1392 in present-day Ludu County, 43 kilometers east of Xining in modern-day Qinghai province. Here, marked by the red star. Its location is described in one of its own early Ming dedicatory stele as being on the border connecting the western kingdoms, that is Tibet, and thus at the meeting of the northwest Ming frontier and the eastern border of the Tibetan province of Amdo. Chutansi is one of the earliest expressions of Ming court interest in Tibetan Buddhism, and an examination of Tibetan chronicles and Chinese imperial court records reveals that Chutansi was dependent on the Ming court support and protection. In turn, its patronage was part of a larger Ming Sino-Tibetan border strategy to establish an alliance between the local authorities and the imperial court. So if one maps where the Ming garrisons end, one finds that a network of such court-supported temples picks up, right? So you can see it's right on that line. The early Ming court repeatedly sent eunuchs to inspect and participate in the construction of Tutanse, marking it as an important court construction project on the Chinese Empire's periphery. Tutanse, like Fahaise, is Chinese in architecture, with a mixed Chinese and Tibetan painting and statuary program. So you can see it's based on that kind of imperial model. Everything runs down this kind of central axis, which is not at all the way Tibetan monasteries are necessarily designed. The outer painted gallery, depicting the life of the Buddha in blue-green Chinese landscape paintings, such as you see on the left. I tried not to put too many images side by side, but I think this contrast is quite striking. While inside the halls, the paintings appear quite Tibetan in both style and iconography, such as you see on the right. And here we again, our old friend Mahakali. However Tibetan in style and iconography they may appear at first glance, Chinese painters' hands are revealed in numerous small details, such as the skull crown of Mahakali here on the left, which is painted in the same manner as Ming Wong found in Chinese temples, such as Pilu Si here on the right, where the skulls are strung together through the eye sockets. Right? The Tibetans don't do that. That's one of the advantages of living in a temple for a week and staring at things constantly. Other things include shorts placed modestly over the nudity of figures, which is another characteristic of Chinese production of Tibetan Buddhist imagery, right? Like the corpse they stand on or something like that. This suggests that the Chinese painters of the imperial court atelier were able to adjust the style and iconography of their paintings between Tibetan within the halls and Chinese in the outer galleries. And I should say, too, that there's a stylistic link between the life of the Buddha and Chinese painting styles, but I don't want to drift too far. A brief account of the casting of the central hall's main image, a gilt bronze Buddha, is given in the imperial bestowal of Tutanse's golden Buddha image stele, dated 1418. In this inscription, the Yongle Emperor projects himself as a universal sacral king, or Chakravartin, ruling over his kingdom. Tutanse was once well appointed with such gilt bronzes produced in the Ming court, as evidenced by a surviving near life-size Buddha with a Yongle rain mark, which you see here, right? This thing's like 4.5 feet tall. And there's a almost identical sculpture in the Cernucci Museum in Paris, which we are also going to have in our show. Woohoo! I'm very excited about that. So he's one of the 8 great bodhisattvas which once flanked a central triad. And this example, as I said, is in the Qinghai Provincial Museum. These are created in the imperial workshops and sent west, suggesting a larger pattern of artistic production, right? And they all have Yongle rain marks in 3 languages on the base. Tibetan, Chinese, and Sanskrit. It's not unusual to find sometimes Chinese and Tibetan, but all 3 together seems to be characteristic of these temples on the border. The halls of Tutanse became increasingly splendorous in imperial architecture as one moves towards the rear of the complex. The rear hall is said to be based on a blueprint of Fengtian Hall in Beijing's Forbidden City. The description in a local Tibetan history, the Dome Chojong, implies the rear hall was built as the Yongle Emperor's memorial hall, a statement reiterated in the bilingual dedicatory imperial bestowal of Tutan's rear hall stele, dated 1427. The rear hall also contains a long life to the emperor inscription on a wooden placard, which records that it was erected in 1427 by eunuchs of the Directorate of Imperial Accoutrements. The Director of Imperial Accoutrements, Meng Ji, was sent by the Ming court to personally supervise the construction of the rear hall. Such a high-ranking officer of the imperial construction apparatus was almost certainly accompanied by numerous high-ranking master craftsmen from the imperial atelier. And this hall's architecture and workmanship has been favorably compared to other inner court productions by eunuchs, such as Fahaisi and Zhihuasi in Beijing. Supporting evidence which further expands our understanding of the eunuch Meng Ji's role in the construction of Chutansi's founding is a set of Chinese archival records of successive generations of imperial edicts for donations to the temple. And I quote, "During the Yongle period, imperial envoys such as the eunuch Meng and commander Tianxuan, respecting the imperial edicts, built the two halls, Baoguang, so that's the middle hall, and Longguo, the rear hall, and erected a stele record," which is what you see. Whoops, I go too far. It would seem then from various textual evidence that the main hall, as well as the covered gallery, and 8 of the subsidiary halls were all conceived of as part of the same construction project by the Yongle Emperor, and it is stated directly that Xuande was fulfilling the wishes of his father and thus completing his vision. Textual evidence suggests that Chutansi was only one of a larger pattern of imperial patronage along the Ming-Tibetan frontier. An imperial formulation of Sino-Tibetan and art and architecture is thus suggested by Fahaisi and Chutansi, both early Ming temples of Chinese construction, decorating with various quantities of Tibetan imagery. While one might be tempted to dismiss the Tibetan elements that appear in this otherwise Chinese architectural context found at Chutansi as simply a result of its close proximity to the Sino-Tibetan border, in other words, as a marker of its regionalism or its provincialism, the presence of the Metropolitan Temple, Fahaisi, suggests that a more complex and imperially sponsored formation of Sino-Tibetan art and architecture was operative at these sites in the Ming. All right. Now we get to the Manchus. The Manchus, like the Mongols, were a nomadic people from the north who conquered China and assumed Tibetan Buddhism as a means of political legitimacy in ruling a vast multi-ethnic empire. During the Qing dynasty, Tibetan Buddhism was once again an official religion of the empire. Under the Manchus, the visual language of Buddhist imperial rule was further refined, and the concepts of sacral legitimacy given a finer point, with a special focus on the cult of Manjushri. The Manchu emperors, lacking the proper bloodlines to the Mongol ruling house, traced their own spiritual ancestry to Kublai Khan through the Tibetan succession mechanism of reincarnation. By promoting themselves as emanations of the Bodhisattva of wisdom Manjushri, they declared themselves Kublai Khan reborn, and the rightful inheritors of his Yuan legacy. The Manchu inheritance of Kublai's realm was propagated through the production of religious art. This is especially significant as the incorporation of the Mongols into the Qing dynasty was critical to the survival of the Manchu Empire. Both the Chinggisid lineage of Kublai Khan and the Tibetan Buddhism were both powerful symbols in the Mongol political vocabulary of the 17th century. This was but one of several mutually reinforcing strategies aimed at various subject and neighboring peoples in establishing the solidifying of Manchu's multi-ethnic empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Manchu rulers adopted certain personas in order to turn themselves into representatives of those respective cultures, whether Chinese or Mongol, Confucian or Buddhist, legitimizing their position and appropriating those cultural traditions, but by denying their image as outsiders who gained possession of them through force. And this is a topic well elucidated by Pat Berger's seminal work, Empire of Emptiness. Shortly before the Manchus completed their conquest of China, the first Qing emperor Hong Taiji changed their ethnonym from Jurchen to Manju in 1635, an etymology that seems to have been engineered to claim its very source in the name Manjushri. While both Tibetan and Mongol sources already make Manchu-Manjushri connections as early as the Qing founder's reign, it was the Kangxi emperor who first refers to himself as Manjushri in his preface to the officially commissioned Mongolian translation of the Tibetan Buddhist canon in 1718 to 720. And I quote, "Then Manjushri, the savior of all living forms, with the intellect of all the Buddhas, was transformed into human form and ascended the fearless lion throne of gold. And this was none other than the sublime emperor Kangxi Manjushri," right, me, who asserted and brought joy to the entire vast world. Such divine projections went much further than previous imperial claims. It's interesting to note, though, that the Dalai Lama's, right, the fifth Dalai Lama is doing kind of the same thing in Lhasa at the same time by claiming his, I shouldn't say claiming, but really promoting his source in as an emanation of Avalokiteshvara, and therefore claiming his inheritance of the Tibetan imperial period. However, it was the Qianlong Emperor, more than any other Manchu ruler, who realized the potential of patronizing Tibetan Buddhism, as evidenced by the incredible volume of Tibetan Buddhist images produced by the imperial workshops. Some of the most politically pointed images included many paintings depicting Qianlong as the emanation of Manjushri, and by extension Kublai Khan. They bear the traditional Tibetan iconographic elements of book and sword at his shoulders, right? Visually identifying him as a Manjushri. But there's also Tibetan inscriptions that really unequivocally declare, there's an inscription right here, him as, and I quote, "the sagacious Manjushri, the great being who manifests as Lord of men, King of Buddhist law, may he be steadfast on the Vajra throne." I almost said iron throne, but there you go. Qianlong's unmistakable visage was realistically painted by the Jesuit court painter Giuseppe Castiglione. In his lap, Qianlong holds the golden wheel of the sacral Chakravartin ruler. Above him, his Tibetan Buddhist preceptor, Jangya Rilpe Dorje. The Qianlong Emperor's court chaplain, Jangya Rilpe Dorje, had a guiding hand in the formation of this Sino-Tibetan imperial Buddhist art of the Qing dynasty that would come to symbolize Manchu rulership. Rilpe Dorje, born of Mongolian stock in a Tibetan region, was the highest and most influential Lama of Inner Asia and China, on a par with the Panchen Lama and Dalai Lamas in Tibet and the Jetendampa in Mongolia. From childhood, Rilpe Dorje was educated with the imperial princes, and together they studied Buddhist scripture as well as Chinese, Mongolian, Manchu, and Tibetan. This kind of close contact between monk and emperor from such an early age was unprecedented. Rilpe Dorje's incarnation lineage was the only one manufactured by the Manchus, and was carefully crafted to reflect that this priest-patron relationship between Kublai and Pakpa was reborn quite literally in Qianlong and himself, right? So here you have Rilpe Dorje depicted as his root guru, his Tsawe Lama. In 1745, Rilpe Dorje initiated Qianlong into the rites of a divinely anointed sovereign, or Chakravartin, much as Pakpa did for Kublai. Later, when Rilpe Dorje translated Pakpa's biography into Mongolian in 1753, he drew a direct parallel between these two acts, ruminating that he and the emperor have been connected through many lifetimes, and states directly that Kublai was predecessor of Qianlong in the Manjushri incarnation lineage. That the British diplomat Lord Macartney was told by a Tartar Mongol official during 1793 embassy that Qianlong Emperor was an incarnation of Kublai Khan also suggests that this association was quite well known. Rilpe Dorje became Qianlong's religious teacher and close political confidant, helping the emperor to craft a policy towards Tibet and Mongolia, which underscored Manchu inheritance of Kublai's realm, both politically and symbolically through the production of religious art. Rilpe Dorje produced a definitive iconographic guide for artists, established a workshop of Tanka painting in Beijing, and was given oversight in the production of Buddhist images in the imperial workshops. This Tanka, made by Qing imperial workshops for Qianlong Emperor's 70th birthday, skillfully works in wishes for the long life of the emperor in a rebus for Wan Sui, 10,000 years here, which Therese Bartholomew has elucidated, and her book on rebuses is very helpful. Entire Tibetan temples, such as Samye Monastery and the Potala Palace, were reconstructed in the Manchu summer capital at Chengdu, and were appointed with luxury images such as life-size hollow dry lacquer sculptures. This is a wonderful piece. We're also borrowing this for the exhibition. This is not to suggest that the Mongolian, Chinese, or Manchu empires were ruled as idealized Buddhist kingdoms, but the employment of religious rhetoric was part of their claim to legitimacy, and their deployment of religious ritual was one of the means by which they sought to take and hold power. This is also not to say that this was some kind of cynical manipulation of religion either. To limit motivations to the patronage of Tibetan Buddhism and its art to politics alone is to limit our own view. For religious faith and political acumen are not mutually exclusive, and it would be a mistake to project the cynicism of our age into the past. Even looking to politics today as a lesson, if someone were to use religion for political advantage, I don't know, like George W. Bush saying, "God told me to run for president," this does not preclude the possibility that that person has faith. Indeed, this religio-political system depends on a belief in reincarnation and the efficacy of ritual magic. Thus, the modern Sino-Tibetan political situation is no longer governed by this system and is an entirely different chapter in history. Though, the recent suggestion by a Chinese official that Xi Jinping is considered a living Buddhist deity consciously draws on that past. Please don't tell on me. I don't want to get in trouble. Thank you.